Mike Tyson is one of the names that shook the history of American sports in a way few others have ever done. He became the youngest heavyweight champion in boxing history, unified the major belts, and turned the ring into a place that spread pure fear. Tyson's knockouts didn't just end fights, they shattered opponents' belief in their own survival. Iron Mike stepped into the ring like a storm, fast enough that no one could react, powerful enough that one small mistake was all it took for the other guy to go down. In his prime years, Tyson wasn't just a champion, he was a symbol of primal power, the embodiment of glorified violence, the collective nightmare of an entire era of boxing. Fame, money, glory, and the fear of the whole world were handed to him before he had even matured as a person. But at 59, Mike Tyson is still alive, and that in itself is another kind of triumph, because he is no longer whole. Behind the knockout victories, the titles, and the roar of the crowds was a human being worn down by trauma, by soul-deep cracks that were never healed. The world once trembled before his fists, but almost no one feared for the child Mike Tyson once was. No one asked how that boy had survived amid violence, poverty, and abandonment. The legend of Mike Tyson is often told through scandals, prison sentences, public falls, and endless controversies, rarely through peace, because peace has never been part of his life. What happens when a child grows up in violence, learns to fight before learning to live, and is suddenly given absolute power, unlimited money, and the fear of the entire world? For Tyson, strength didn't save him, it only amplified every pain that already existed. He fell many times, not just in the ring but in life itself, facing shame, addiction, loneliness, and irreplaceable loss. Yet what makes Mike Tyson's story more tragic than anything isn't the falls, it's that he kept existing after them all. At 59, with the lights off and the cheers just memories, Tyson is no longer the man who made the world terrified. He's a human being covered in scars but still trying to move forward. To understand why that legend was never protected, why strength couldn't save a soul damaged since childhood, we have to go back to where the tragedy began. Brownsville, Brooklyn, where a child learned to become a monster just to survive. If you want to understand what turned an abandoned boy into the man who made the whole world terrified, subscribe to the channel and keep following us in the next part of this story. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next part, where Mike Tyson's real tragedy truly begins. Brownsville, Brooklyn isn't a place where people grow up, it's a place where people learn to survive. It's a neighborhood where violence doesn't come as an incident, but exists like the air, silent, constant, without needing a reason. Old buildings, stairwells dark with the smell of damp mold, alleys where screams echo more often than laughter. Poverty isn't just a lack of money, it's the feeling of being trapped, a despair passed down from generation to generation. Kids in Brownsville aren't asked what their dreams are, they're taught how to run, how to hide, and most importantly, how not to become the weak one. In that setting, Mike Tyson appeared as a painful paradox. A small kid, with a lisp, eyes always darting because he was afraid of being noticed, afraid of being called out. Mike didn't look like a ruler, he looked like prey. In Brownsville, that was a death sentence. The other kids quickly spotted that difference. They mocked Mike's voice, shoved him down on the street, beat him just because they could. Every day going to school was a chase. Every afternoon coming home was another taste of humiliation. Mike learned to keep his head down, but keeping his head down didn't save him. In Brownsville, weakness doesn't earn pity, it earns pursuit. There was no father to step in and block those punches. Mike's dad was almost completely absent from his life, existing only as an unexplained void. His mother, Lorna Mae Tyson, was a worn-out woman. She tried to raise her kids in poverty, under pressure, in a world that had already been too harsh to her. But love isn't always enough. Lorna had no time, no energy, and no tools to shield her son from a street that was always hungry for violence. Mike grew up in a home where silence often replaced comfort, where the exhaustion of adults weighed heavily on children who hadn't yet understood the world. When Mike got beat up, there were no arms waiting for him. When Mike cried, no one heard. And gradually he learned a brutal lesson: No one is coming to save you. In that world full of beatings, Mike found something strange that gave him a rare sense of safety: pigeons. On the rooftops of buildings, in makeshift coops, Mike cared for them with a tenderness he had never received from people. Pigeons didn't mock him when he lisped. They didn't hit him when he was quiet. They didn't ask why he was weak. They just stood there, quietly, accepting him. In Mike's world, where every glance could turn into a threat, pigeons were the only creatures that didn't scare him. He fed them, talked to them, and in those brief moments, Mike felt like he mattered to something. But even that fragile comfort didn't last. One day the other kids killed Mike's pigeon just to mock him. It wasn't just a cruel prank, it was a message. This world wouldn't let him keep anything soft. After that day, Mike Tyson changed. Not in one dramatic moment, but in a quiet and painful process. The beatings no longer just instilled fear, they became lessons. Every hit taught him that if he didn't strike first, he'd be the one on the ground. If he didn't make others afraid, he'd always be the one hunted. Mike started fighting back, not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. The anger inside him grew, nameless, with no outlet. It built up through every humiliation, every afternoon coming home with torn clothes and a bloody lip. In Brownsville, no one told Mike that anger was dangerous. On the contrary, the street taught him it was the only thing that could protect him. Mike Tyson's childhood had no hiding place, no safe playground, no adult stepping in to say everything would be okay. Just cold streets, prying eyes, and the constant feeling of having to stay alert. In that environment, Mike didn't learn to trust, he learned to survive. And when a child is pushed to the point of only two choices, be a victim or be a threat, the path he takes is almost no longer a question. Those first beatings didn't just hurt Mike's body, they etched a cruel truth into his mind. Weakness is a death sentence. And from that sentence, a different person began to form. Not the Mike Tyson the world would later fear, but the Brownsville kid who decided he would never let himself get beaten again, no matter the cost of losing himself. After Brownsville, Mike Tyson was no longer a child, even though he was still far too young to understand what living really meant. He entered a phase where fighting was no longer just a momentary reaction to fear, but the only way to exist. On those streets, every day was a test of status. The weak got crushed, the hesitant got dragged down. Mike learned that early, not through words, but through aching ribs and bruises that never had time to heal. He learned to look people straight in the eye, to clench his fists before the trembling could show. Mike's first fights had no rules, no audience, just fear and instinct. And every time he fought back successfully, every time someone else backed down, he felt something new, the feeling that he wasn't completely powerless. That feeling was dangerous, but addictive. The line between self-defense and violence quickly blurred. Mike started seeking out fights not just to protect himself, but to prove he was no longer an easy target. The anger inside him now had soil to take root in. It no longer erupted randomly but was fed every day. At the same time, Brownsville kept teaching Mike other lessons. Stealing wasn't out of greed but survival. Taking from others wasn't malice but a sense of control, something he had never had in life. Mike got pulled into a spiral of petty crimes that grew bigger, as if the street was testing how far he was willing to go, and he went without looking back, because there was nothing waiting behind him. The arrests came sooner than expected. Mike Tyson was familiar with jail cells before he was even grown, with cold fluorescent lights, with being looked at like a problem to be removed. He didn't cry, didn't resist, didn't beg. Inside him, a wrong but solid belief started forming. The world had already decided who he was. When they took him away, Mike felt less shame than familiarity. It was just another chapter in a life he had never controlled. But juvenile detention was different. There, everything was designed to crush whatever innocence remained. The other kids didn't just carry anger, they carried skill in using it. There, violence wasn't unusual. It was the unit of measurement. In juvenile detention, Mike Tyson was no longer the victim like on the streets. He grew faster, tougher, and learned to strike before being attacked. If Brownsville taught him that weakness was a death sentence, detention taught him that intimidation was a shield. Mike started being looked at differently, with caution. He didn't need to talk much, his fists started speaking for him. Every time he won a fight, every time someone avoided his eyes, Mike felt he existed more clearly. No one dared mock his voice anymore. No one dared kill his pigeons anymore. But the price for that silence was huge. Mike didn't learn to trust people, didn't learn to share, didn't learn to love. He only learned one thing: how to make others afraid. Gradually, violence was no longer just an instant reflex to danger. It became Mike Tyson's language. When he didn't know what to say, he hit. When he felt insulted, he hit. When he felt empty, he hit. His fists became the only communication tool he trusted. Every punch was a short, direct statement: "Don't touch me." But deep inside, it was still a child who had never been taught how to live with fear. Mike didn't know how to ask questions about the future, because the present was dangerous enough. He didn't think about tomorrow. He only thought about surviving until the end of today. It was in that environment that the most dangerous transformation happened. Mike Tyson was no longer just a damaged child. He started becoming what the street respected: a threat. And when society keeps treating a child like a problem to be suppressed, that child will sooner or later act like what people fear. No one in detention asked Mike why he was angry. No one asked what he had lost. They just looked at the behavior and responded with harsher discipline. And so the cycle closed. Violence breeds violence. Fear breeds fear. And Mike Tyson, in silence, kept growing up in a world where fighting was seen as a basic life skill. He walked out of juvenile detention with a tougher body and colder eyes, but what he didn't carry with him was a map for life. Mike knew how to fight, how to make others back down, but not how to move forward. Everything he had learned up to that point wasn't how to be a person, but how not to be crushed. And in a society always ready to discard kids like him, that seemed enough, at least enough to survive. But it was from here that the path leading Mike Tyson to both glory and tragedy started becoming clearer than ever. Mike Tyson walked out of juvenile detention with a harder body, colder eyes, but inside still a child with no anchor. He knew how to throw punches, how to make others back down, but not where he was going. And then, in what seemed like a small twist of fate, he met Cus D'Amato, not on a big stage, not under bright lights, but in an old gym where the smell of sweat and metal mixed with tense silence. Cus didn't look at Mike the way others did, not as a troubled kid, not as a potential danger to control. He looked deeper. He saw what almost no one wanted to see: bottled up anger and unnamed fear. In Mike's eyes, Cus saw not just violence but a panicked child, always ready to strike first because he didn't believe he would be protected. Cus D'Amato understood that anger, not to exploit it blindly but to shape it. For Cus, boxing wasn't just a sport, it was a system of discipline replacing the family Mike never had. Training sessions didn't just teach how to punch, but how to stand straight, control breathing, wait for the right moment. Cus talked to Mike about fear like it was a friend, not an enemy. He taught him that fear didn't need to be destroyed, but understood and controlled. For the first time in his life, Mike heard an adult talk about his emotions without calling it weakness. For the first time, his anger wasn't punished or encouraged unconditionally but guided. Cus didn't just train Mike, he held him. He set boundaries that had never existed before: schedules, discipline, responsibility, concepts alien to a kid raised in street violence. Cus watched every step Mike took, not because he didn't trust him, but because he knew what would happen if he was abandoned one more time. In the gym, Cus was the commander. Outside the gym, he was the overseer, the reminder, the only one who dared say no to Mike Tyson. And most importantly, Mike accepted it. Not out of fear but because for the first time he felt someone wouldn't leave when things got hard. Under Cus' hands, boxing became a life structure. Every session was a ritual. Every sparring match was a lesson in patience. Cus taught Mike that victory starts before stepping into the ring and thinking, in self-control. He told Mike that if you don't control fear, fear will control you. Those words weren't fancy, but they hit the deepest part of Mike, because his whole life, Mike had been controlled by fear. Fear of being beaten, fear of being mocked, fear of being abandoned. Cus didn't erase those fears, he gave Mike a way to live with them. In those years, Mike Tyson changed in a way hard to notice from the outside but profoundly deep inside. He no longer fought just for revenge. He started fighting with purpose, every punch placed exactly right, at the right time, not to prove he was scary, but to prove he was in control. With Cus, power wasn't hitting the hardest, but hitting when needed, and stopping when you had to. This was something Mike had never learned before. On the streets and in detention, stopping meant getting crushed, but Cus taught him that in the ring, discipline decides who survives. The relationship between Mike and Cus wasn't like a typical coach-athlete one. It had the shape of a father-son bond that both had lacked. Cus became the one shaping not just technique, but Mike's very identity. He knew Mike's anger could be a weapon, but also a disaster if not held tight. So Cus controlled every little detail, from diet and sleep to the people around Mike. To outsiders, it seemed harsh. But to Mike, it was the first time his life had order, rules, someone responsible if he went off track. For the first time in his life, Mike Tyson felt held, not pushed away, not seen as a burden, not left alone with his own anger. Cus didn't promise Mike glory or money. He promised discipline, control, a path that if followed long enough, Mike could escape the fate Brownsville had drawn for him. And Mike believed him, believed absolutely. In Mike's world then, Cus was the only compass, the only voice he listened to, the only one standing between him and the storm inside. But right here, in this moment that seemed like salvation, another seed of tragedy quietly formed. Because when a person is held together only by one single anchor, their existence becomes frighteningly fragile. Cus D'Amato kept Mike Tyson from falling into the abyss, but he also became the last wall separating Mike from his own unhealed nature. Mike hadn't learned to hold himself. He learned to rely on Cus to stay upright. And when everything later changed, when that wall was gone, the price Mike would pay would be greater than any punch he ever threw. But at this point, in those early days under Cus D'Amato's guidance, Mike Tyson didn't know that future. He only knew one simple and priceless thing. For the first time in his life, someone looked at him and decided not to let go. Under Cus D'Amato's hands, fear was no longer something to hide or deny. It became raw material, something to be honed, shaped and turned into a weapon. Cus didn't teach Mike Tyson how to fight first. He taught him how to make his opponents afraid. If they're scared of you before the bell rings, Cus said, the fight's already over. That philosophy sank into Mike slowly but deeply. He learned that victory didn't start in the first round. It started with the look in his eyes, the way he walked to the ring, the heavy silence that made the other guy wonder if he'd survive the night. Cus taught Mike how to plant fear like a seed, letting it grow in the opponent's mind before the first punch was even thrown. And Mike understood it instinctively, because he had lived his entire childhood in fear. Now he was just switching roles. Mike learned to kill his opponents in their minds, before he hit them with his fists. He stood in front of the mirror, muttering the affirmations Cus gave him, repeating them until they became truth in his head. You will destroy him. No one can touch you. You are fear. It wasn't bragging. It was how Mike built armor for his fragile soul. Every training session, every drop of sweat hitting the floor. Mike wasn't just building muscle. He was burying deeper the feeling of weakness that once made him prey on the streets of Brownsville. Cus watched and adjusted, keeping Mike in line, but never suppressing the ferocity taking shape. He knew if he tried to turn Mike into something gentle, he'd lose the one thing that could save him from his past. Mike needed permission to be terrifying, but controlled. Iron Mike was born from those very insecurities and hatreds, not a fake persona, but the crystallization of everything Mike had endured. Every punch was an answer to the laughter over his lisp. Every time an opponent stepped back was revenge for the afternoons. Mike came home with torn clothes and blood on his lips. Iron Mike wasn't born to entertain. He was born to intimidate. And in Cus's gym, Mike was taught that there was no shame in that. On the contrary, it was an advantage. Cus turned rage into strategy, fear into fuel, a trembling kid into a machine that knew exactly when to strike and when to wait. Boxing, under that philosophy, was no longer just a sport. It became the place where Mike was allowed to be a monster without punishment. On the streets, violence got him arrested. In reform school, violence got him isolated. But in the ring, violence was celebrated, applauded, called talent. It was a paradox Mike didn't need to think about, to accept. For the first time, the world didn't just allow him to hit, it paid him for it. The punches that once made him a problem now made him the solution. Mike threw himself into training with the obsession of someone terrified of going back to where he came from. Each day, Iron Mike became sharper, while the Brownsville kid faded, drowned under layers of muscle and an icy stare. Cost was still there, like a gatekeeper. He reminded Mike that power only mattered when it was controlled. But even Cost couldn't erase this truth. Boxing gave Mike a stage to unload everything he couldn't put into words. Mike didn't need to explain his feelings. He didn't need to talk about his childhood or abandonment. He just needed to fight. And every time an opponent went down, some part of Mike felt vindicated. That feeling was so dangerous it became addictive. It made Mike believe that if he kept winning, kept spreading fear, he'd never have to go back to being that hunted kid. But deep beneath the Iron Mike shell, the old fear was still there. Fear of being touched, fear of being hurt, fear of being abandoned again. Cus understood this and tried to keep Mike within bounds. He controlled the training schedule, the words, the relationships, because he knew that if Mike slipped out of the frame, the monster would have no one to rein it in. During these years, a fragile balance was maintained. Mike fought, won, and felt like he existed. Cus kept the rhythm, the limits, kept Mike walking the tightrope between glory and disaster. Iron Mike at this stage was a perfect weapon forged from fear, but every weapon needs someone gripping the handle. Mike had never learned to do that himself. He learned to trust that Cost would always be there, that an invisible hand would control the storm inside him. And while the world started hearing the name Mike Tyson with curiosity and caution, no one realized that the monster they were about to worship was built on a very fragile foundation. Boxing had given Mike permission to be a monster, but it had never taught him how to become human again. Cus D'Amato's death didn't come as a loud shock, but as a deadly silence. It opened up while Mike Tyson was still standing on the fragile tightrope Cus had built between discipline and instinct, between man and monster. When Cus died, Mike didn't just lose a trainer, he lost the only person who knew how to keep his rage caged. In the familiar gym where Cus's low voice once echoed, there was suddenly only Mike's breathing and a silence heavy as lead. No one stood in front anymore to stop Mike, to say enough to pull the Brownsville kid out of the storm that had just been unleashed. The funeral ended, and life didn't wait for Mike to grasp what he'd lost. Success came almost immediately, overwhelming and relentless, as if fate was mocking him. Win after win, fame swelling, lights brighter than ever. Mike stepped into the ring with power sharpened by Cus's philosophy, but without the hand guiding it. The carefully trained monster now stood alone before the world. Every punch landed, every victory convinced, but behind the glory was a terrifying truth. Mike no longer knew what he was fighting for, other than to keep fighting. Cus had been the anchor, the final boundary between discipline and chaos. When that anchor vanished, the ship named Mike Tyson began drifting, powerful but directionless. No one was left to keep the rage caged. The affirmations once controlled by Cus now echoed without rebuttal. Mike still repeated them in his head, but no one reminded him that fear was meant to be used, not unleashed. Success made everyone around him hesitate to say, no. Nods replaced warnings. Applause replaced limits. Mike entered a world where his power wasn't just accepted, it was encouraged. And that was the most dangerous environment for someone who had never learned self-restraint. Cus had understood that Mike needed discipline more than praise, but after the funeral, Mike only had praise. The new people around him didn't see the trembling kid from long ago, didn't see the fear of abandonment lurking inside. They saw a champion rising, a winning machine bringing money and fame. Mike sensed this, and part of him believed that if he kept winning, kept making the world afraid, the void Cus left would fill itself. But it didn't. It widened. Every victory was a temporary cover for the unnamed loss. Every quiet night after the lights was a deeper slide away from the person Cus had tried to preserve. Fate began slipping from Mike's grasp in ways that were hard to notice at first, not with an obvious fall, but with loosening habits, blurred boundaries. Training still happened, but discipline wasn't as sharp. Advice still came, but it lacked Cus's moral weight. Mike started believing that the fear he instilled was proof enough of control. He forgot that Cus had taught him fear is only a tool when someone holds the handle firmly. When no one holds it, it turns back to bite its owner. In rare moments, Mike felt that absence like a dull ache. He missed Cus's voice, the tightly guided sessions, the feeling of someone standing between him and the abyss. But instead of facing that pain, Mike rushed forward faster. He won quicker, more brutally, as if speed could blur the memory of the recent funeral. Success came so early it gave Mike no time to properly grieve, and pain that isn't grieved finds its way back through other paths. Cus had been the only one close enough to see when Mike started slipping. After he was gone, no one was close enough anymore. Those around him saw results, not process. They saw knockouts, not sleepless nights. They saw lights, not darkness. Mike Tyson, in this phase, became the perfect image of a paradox, stronger than ever, but more fragile than ever. He had everything a champion could dream of, except the one thing Cus had provided: a boundary. And when the boundary disappeared, disaster didn't need to knock. It just waited. Waited until Mike believed he didn't need anyone to hold him back. Waited until the rage, once forged into a weapon, escaped the cage and started finding its own way. Mike Tyson's career was still rising, but his life, from the moment Cus D'Amato left, had begun a different journey, one of sliding out of his own grasp. Without Cus D'Amato behind him, Mike Tyson charged straight into history, at a speed that history itself couldn't keep up with who he really was. At an age when many are still figuring out how to live independently, Mike became the youngest heavyweight boxing champion in the world. A title that should have been the pinnacle of maturity, but for Mike it came too early, too fast, and too heavy. The world didn't see a kid who hadn't grown up yet. The world saw a creature of destructive power, stepping into the ring as if born to spread fear. And Mike, who had never been taught how to be a person, was forced to learn how to be an icon before learning how to be himself. Mike Tyson's fights in this period weren't like sports. They were brief executions. The bell barely rang before the opponent fell. KOs came fast, cold, brutal, merciless. Mike's eyes empty, footsteps heavy, each punch carrying all the unresolved rage. The crowd stood and cheered, but inside the ring there was no joy. Only endings. Only silence after another man lay down. Mike didn't celebrate. He didn't know what to celebrate. For him, victory wasn't a moment of happiness. It was proof that he was still safe, that no one could touch him. The world called it greatness. Mike just called it necessary. Fame exploded faster than any protective mechanism could form. Money flooded Mike's life like a storm. Numbers the Brownsville kid never dared dream of now arrived weekly, monthly. Luxury cars, mansions, expensive clothes, all at once with no instruction manual. Women surrounded him, power opened every door, and no one asked if Mike was ready for it. No one taught him the difference between desire and filling a void. Mike entered that world like a child handed absolute power without a moral compass. And the world didn't wait for him to mature. It just exploited. Mike Tyson began confusing fear with respect. In the ring, people feared him. In life, people were wary of him. But no one stayed long enough to understand him. And Mike, who had never been loved properly, started believing that if people feared him, they wouldn't abandon him. That was a fatal mistake. Fear creates distance, not connection. But Mike didn't know that. All his childhood taught him one lesson: if you don't make others afraid, you get crushed. Now the whole world trembled before him, and Mike thought he'd finally won. But that victory brought no peace. It only covered a growing emptiness inside. Inside the youngest champion in history was a nameless void. Mike woke up in lavish rooms but felt like he belonged nowhere. He had everything society calls success, but no solid identity to hold on to. KOs had been the one telling him who he was, what to do, where to stop. Now no one did. Mike decided everything himself, but those decisions came from someone never taught self-regulation. He dove into indulgence not for joy, but because he feared being alone with his own thoughts. Silence panicked him more than any opponent. Power distorted every relationship around Mike. No one dared tell the truth. No one dared object. Warnings, if any, were swallowed by money and lights. Mike gradually believed everything he did was allowed, because he was the champion. But that permission didn't come with responsibility. No one told him power needed control not just in the ring but in life. No one taught him that people could fear him without respecting him. And Mike, lacking life experience, lacking emotional foundation, kept going further down a road with no warning signs. Rare moments of weakness appeared and vanished quickly. Mike sometimes wondered why winning didn't make him happy. Why, after each fight, instead of relief, he felt emptier. But those questions weren't nurtured. They were drowned by schedules, parties, praise. Mike wasn't encouraged to reflect. He was encouraged to keep winning. And he did it brilliantly. But each victory was a step further from his true self. At an age when many are still learning to take responsibility for their emotions, Mike Tyson had to carry the role of a global icon. But icons aren't allowed to be confused, aren't allowed to be weak, aren't allowed to ask, "Who am I?" So Mike buried those questions deeper, under muscle, under the cold stare, under the Iron Mike image the world demanded. He kept KOing opponents, kept making people afraid, kept reinforcing the reputation of an invincible monster. But each time he lost a little more of his ability to connect with himself. The youngest heavyweight champion in history stood at the top with no railing, no guide, no cause, no structure holding him back, just power, money, and unconditional worship. Mike Tyson at this point was global fear. But at the same time, he was a person too young to be a person, thrust into a role he hadn't understood, hadn't prepared for, and had never been taught how to escape. And from that immaturity, greater tragedies were quietly forming, waiting for their moment to spill into the light. When Mike Tyson entered this phase of his life, the greatest danger no longer lay in opponents in the ring, but in the silence of those around him. No one dared say no to a winning monster. No one dared question the person bringing money, fame, and power. The environment around Mike gradually warped, not because he intentionally created it, but because his power distorted every reflection. Advice turned into flattery, warnings turned into indulgence, and Mike, who had never learned to set his own limits, began believing he truly needed none. The people who once enforced discipline were replaced by those holding keys to a life of pleasure. They didn't ask what Mike needed to get better, they asked what he wanted to feel good. Boxing, the only framework that once kept Mike upright, gradually slipped to secondary status. Training sessions lost the strict ritual of the Cus D'Amato era. They became casual, shortened, delayed by parties, by endless nights. Mike still entered the gym, but no longer as someone who needed to survive. He entered as someone who believed victory was his birthright. Mike's body was still strong, still fast, but his mind began to crack. Training was no longer about facing himself. It became routine. Small details, the ones Cus saw as the line between control and chaos, were ignored. Mike lost patience for refining technique. He relied on instinct, raw power, the reputation that made opponents tremble in the locker room. Confidence, once earned through discipline, slid into recklessness. Mike no longer prepared for fights, as if his life depended on it. He prepared as if the opponent was already beaten. The environment didn't just tolerate it, it fed that ego. Every win was exaggerated. Every mistake was covered. Those profiting from Mike had no reason to pull him back. They needed Iron Mike to exist. Terrifying, violent, uncontrollable. That image sold tickets. That image made money. And Mike, already confusing fear with respect, believed the surrounding silence proved his greatness. He didn't realize it was also the sign of deepest isolation. No one had the courage left to save him from himself. Inside, the emptiness didn't go away. It was just covered by noise. Mike chased stronger thrills to fill the void victories couldn't touch. When the cheers died, the unease returned, and instead of returning to discipline, Mike sought things that numbed the feeling. He drifted further from the self-custody it once held firm, not because Mike was becoming worse, but because no one was left to help him become better. Power, when unchallenged, becomes the most dangerous lie a person can believe. In the ring, Mike was still fear itself. But that fear began to show cracks. New opponents no longer just saw the monster, they started seeing the lack of preparation, the moments of lost focus, the rounds dragging longer than expected. Mike still won, but no longer in that untouchable way. And each time it happened, instead of adjusting, he reacted with pride. He believed that just increasing power, increasing ferocity, was enough. But boxing isn't a place where raw strength always wins. It's where discipline punishes complacency. Fate didn't need to rush. It waited patiently. Waited for someone accustomed to going unchallenged to step into the moment that required the most humility. Waited for a monster used to quick victories to face prolonged resistance. Waited for a champion who believed he was invincible to forget that all power has an expiration date. The warning signs were there, but they were drowned out by the cheers. No one dared say stop. No one dared say you're slipping, and Mike, surrounded by nods, kept moving forward without knowing what he was heading straight into. At this point, tragedy was no longer a distant possibility, it was fully prepared. A man with extraordinary power, an environment without pushback, eroded discipline, and an ego grown larger than the ability to control it. Fate didn't need to deliver the decisive blow. It just needed Mike to step into a moment where instinct wasn't enough, where recklessness had to pay a price. And when that moment came, the world would no longer see Iron Mike the same way, not because he'd grown weak, but because he'd been left too long in the role of a monster no one dared say no to. And then the moment fate had patiently waited for finally arrived, not on the familiar stage of Las Vegas, not amid grand ceremonies, but on a strange night in Tokyo, where Mike Tyson stepped into the ring as if going through a predetermined formality. The opponent named Buster Douglas, a name the world saw as a footnote, someone chosen to fall in order to polish the Iron Mike legend further. Predictions didn't discuss whether Mike would win, only in which round Mike would finish him. Even Mike believed it. He walked to the canvas with the stride of someone who'd already won, carrying complacency nurtured too long, and in that certainty, the myth began to crack. The fight didn't follow the familiar script. Buster Douglas wasn't afraid, didn't back down, wasn't swallowed by Mike's icy stare. From the early rounds, the anomaly was clear. Mike couldn't finish it. Punches thrown weren't absolutely precise anymore. Distance misjudged, rhythm broken, and each time Douglas stood firm after blows that should have dropped him, something began to waver in Mike. For the first time in years, he faced someone who didn't believe in the myth, someone who refused the role of victim. Mike didn't just lose that fight, he collapsed. Douglas's punch in the 10th round didn't just drop the body, it dropped the entire mental structure Mike had built from fear. When Mike hit the canvas, his mouthpiece fell out, his eyes lost, confused, not understanding what was happening. He tried to get up, but his body wouldn't obey. No Cus at ringside to shout the familiar commands. No control, no plan B. Just a man forced to face what he'd avoided for years, helplessness. The world held its breath, not out of fear, but out of disbelief. Iron Mike, the symbol of destruction, lay there, being counted out. Each number called stripped away a layer of the legend. When the referees stopped the fight, there were no cheers of victory, just stunned silence. The shock rippled across the planet. Fans who'd believed Mike was unbeatable now had to stare at the truth. The monster could fall. And in that moment, the world didn't just see a loss, the world saw the fragility Mike had hidden under quick knockouts. For Mike Tyson, this wasn't simply losing the belt, it was losing his identity. He didn't know who he was without being the invincible one. For years Mike had built himself around other people's fear. When that fear vanished, there was nothing left to hold him up. On the Tokyo canvas, Iron Mike first understood what it meant to be out of control, unable to punch his way out, unable to make the opponent back down, unable to use violence to reclaim power, and that panicked him in a deeper way than any street fight from his childhood. This loss exposed everything that had been ignored, the lack of discipline, the arrogance, the unchallenged environment, and the unprocessed pain of losing Cus. Mike didn't lose because he was physically weaker. He lost because he no longer had the mental foundation to stand when things didn't go his way. Buster Douglas, on one extraordinary night, didn't just beat a champion. He inadvertently forced Mike to see his real self, a man who had never learned to get back up without others' fear to lean on. As Mike left the ring, there were no blinding lights of a winner, just the heavy steps of someone stripped of his armor. Questions started emerging, not just from the media but from inside Mike. If I'm not Iron Mike, then who am I? But instead of seeking answers, Mike carried that wound out of Tokyo, not ready to face it. And when someone carries unprocessed shame, they often try to compensate through even more dangerous paths. The Tokyo night didn't kill Mike Tyson's career immediately, but it killed the illusion that had protected him too long. The myth died on the canvas, and what remained was a raw, hurting man unprepared for a world that no longer feared him. Iron Mike first tasted helplessness, and from that moment, the next chain of tragedies began accelerating, with no one close enough to pull him back. After the Tokyo night, Mike Tyson walked out of the ring with a crack no punch could mend, but the real tragedy didn't stop there. It kept sliding, heavier, until 1992 arrived like a clean cut into what remained of the legend's life. The case, the trial, the sentence, all played out on camera, before the public, before an America that had once cheered Mike as a symbol of power. When the judge's gavel fell, there were no cheers, no lights, no protection from fame, just a naked truth. Mike Tyson, heavyweight champion, became a prisoner. That moment wasn't just the collapse of a career. It was the complete reversal of power. The man who once made the world tremble was now led away in silence, wearing a number, a uniform, an identity he'd never prepared to face. From icon to inmate, the distance wasn't measured in meters or years, but in stripped dignity. Mike no longer controlled his schedule, no longer decided what he ate, when he slept, who he saw. Everything was decided for him. And for the first time in a long while, violence was no longer the language that kept him standing. In prison, the power of the fist became meaningless. The early days were absolute isolation. No crowds, no flatterers, no environment feeding the ego. Just four walls and a silence that echoed painfully. Mike felt shame creep into every breath. Shame not over lost money or fame, but because for the first time he couldn't escape his own gaze. The rage was still there, coiling fiercely, but with nowhere to release it. No opponents, no ring, no one to intimidate. The rage turned inward, gnawing from within. In prison, Mike Tyson faced what he'd avoided his whole life, himself without the armor. On long nights when the metal doors clanged shut, he saw in the mirror not Iron Mike, not the champion, but the Brownsville kid with the panicked eyes from years ago. The kid who'd been beaten, mocked, abandoned. The kid who learned to hit before he learned to live. No Cus to tell him what to do. No audience to hide the weakness. Just a naked man forced to ask the question he'd never dared. What have I become? Prison didn't give Mike answers, but it forced him to sit with the question. Power, which once opened every door, couldn't open the iron one in front of him. Money, which once bought silence and obedience, couldn't buy peace. Fame, which once made others afraid, didn't make the nights less cold. Mike learned a brutal but necessary lesson. No championship belt can shield the soul. When everything is stripped away, what's left is what defines a person. Mike's anger in this phase didn't disappear. It changed shape. Sometimes it flared into hatred of a world that turned its back. Sometimes it sank into self-loathing. There were days Mike believed he was a victim of circumstances, of environment, of choices pushed too early. But there were also nights he couldn't escape personal responsibility. Those moments hurt the most, because taking responsibility meant accepting that not every tragedy was caused by others, and that for someone used to solving everything with fists, was the harshest challenge. In prison, Mike was no longer allowed to be the monster. No one applauded ferocity. No one celebrated rage. Here, survival required a different skill: endurance, enduring monotony, enduring memories, enduring the feeling of being forgotten. Mike, who once feared silence more than any opponent, now had to live with it every day. And in that silence, fragments of the real man began to surface, painful but undeniable. Not every day was a day of awakening. There were days Mike sank deeper into anger, into denial, but there were also rare fragile moments, when he realized that if he didn't face that Brownsville kid, he'd remain a prisoner forever, whether he walked out or not. Prison, paradoxically, became the first place in Mike's life where he couldn't run from the past, couldn't run from fear, couldn't run from the responsibility of becoming an adult he'd never been taught to be. When the iron doors closed each night, Mike understood that his career might return, fame might revive, but if his soul remained empty, every victory would lead him back here, in one form or another. And in that space where power meant nothing, Mike Tyson began to grasp a truth Cus had hinted at, but never fully taught. The greatest strength isn't in making others afraid, but in facing yourself when no one is afraid of you anymore. When Mike Tyson walked out of prison, the outside world greeted him with curiosity mixed with bloodlust, not because they believed in redemption, but because they wanted to know if the monster still worked. Boxing welcomed him back faster than any understanding. The ring was still there, the lights still bright, the cheers loud enough to drown out the years behind bars. Mike returned to training with a body that still held terrifying power, muscles still bulging, punches still heavy, but inside what once held him upright had shattered. Prison had stripped the illusion of power, but hadn't taught him how to rebuild the man. Mike came back like a house rebuilt on cracked foundations, still towering, but shaking in every wind. The first wins after release made many believe the old story would repeat. Mike hit fast, hit hard, opponents fell, but something was different. His eyes no longer held cold focus, but a tension waiting to explode. Boxing was no longer the saving discipline, it was the last escape, so Mike wouldn't have to face the fragments in his head. He stepped into the ring, not to display skill, but to unload accumulated pressure. Every round that dragged was a mental test, not for the opponent, but for Mike himself. The body could return to form, but the mind couldn't. Mike trained but without patience. He threw punches, but without the refined calculation Cus D'Amato had once etched in. Frustration appeared sooner, heavier. When the fight didn't go his way, Mike didn't adjust, he reacted. That was the most dangerous sign. Instinct overpowering strategy. And the world, always waiting for the next collapse, began seeing the cracks more clearly. It all converged in 1997, in the rematch with Evander Holyfield. No longer just a boxing match, it was a clash of two world views. Holyfield represented discipline, endurance, a resilience forged through control. Mike represented unhealed rage, pent-up pressure, fear of failure returning. From the early rounds, Mike struggled. Holyfield didn't retreat from power, didn't fear the reputation. Each clash was a rejection of the Iron Mike myth. And when the myth was rejected, Mike didn't know what to do with the surging emotions. Frustration built into panic. Mike felt cornered, not just in the ring, but in his own identity. He believed he was being treated unfairly, that the world was once again against him. But instead of adapting, Mike lost his last anchor, self-control. The moment he bit Holyfield's ear wasn't a tactical decision. It was a desperate reflex from a man with no other tools to handle emotion. When Mike's teeth touched his opponent's ear, it wasn't just a rules violation, it was the sound of a mind collapsing. The whole world went silent. No more debates about boxing, no more talk of technique, just the cold question, what happened to Mike Tyson? That image, replayed everywhere, froze him in collective memory, as the moment of total loss of control. Iron Mike was no longer a respected fear, he became a symbol of chaos. And in that moment, everything Mike had tried to rebuild after prison collapsed again, publicly, undeniably. For Mike, it was the point of no return. No one could say it was just an accident, just a slip. The act exposed the truth many avoided. He had never returned to the old self, because that old self had never been healed. Boxing could return money, return lights, but it couldn't return the mental foundation eroded by years of violence, loss, and isolation. Holyfield left the ring with victory. Mike left with a scar no title could hide. After that night, Mike Tyson still had a career, but no illusions. He understood the body could recover, but the mind didn't follow training schedules. Control, the thing Cus once held tight, was now a luxury. The world saw a champion return to the ring, but saw more clearly than ever Mike Tyson couldn't go back to who he was, because that person had been neglected too long to remain whole. And from that moment, Mike's story shifted to a different chapter, one where getting up was no longer measured by wins, but by the ability to keep living with what couldn't be fixed. After the ear-biting moment that silenced the world, Mike Tyson didn't collapse loudly anymore. He self-destructed quietly. No more stunning KOs, no more fateful nights rewriting history, just long days drifting in a weary cycle of escape. Addiction entered Mike's life, not as pleasure, but as a temporary life raft for someone sinking. Substances didn't bring happiness, they just silenced memories that wouldn't sleep. Each use was Mike pulling a curtain in front of the mirror, so he wouldn't have to see the Brownsville kid staring back with accusing eyes. Money, once proof of invincibility, now fueled the disintegration. Contracts, cars, mansions, endless parties, all dissipated faster than the speed Mike once used to drop opponents. Not because he didn't know how to hold money, but because he didn't know how to hold himself. Without inner discipline, every dollar was sand through fingers. The people who once stood around Mike for the glow gradually withdrew, leaving wide rooms and cold silence. Mike once made people afraid, now the fear was gone. In its place was pity, a feeling that hurt more than hate, because it said people had stopped expecting anything. Loneliness didn't come as punishment, it came as consequence. Mike lived among crowds, but had no one. Conversations grew superficial, relationships rootless. He didn't trust anyone long enough to lean on, nor let anyone close enough to touch the wounds. Boxing had once been the language, the escape, the structure. When boxing could no longer hold him, Mike had no replacement language. He didn't know how to talk about fear with words, only how to numb it with intense sensation. And each time he numbed it, he moved one step further from the ability to truly feel. In those long nights, Mike Tyson survived, but he didn't live. He woke up, went to sleep, repeated. The body was still there, the heartbeat steady, but meaning had fallen away. No more goals to aim for, no more legend to defend, no more coups to hold the boundaries. Even the rare beautiful memories turned sharp when touched, because they reminded him that he could have been a different person. Mike was no longer afraid of losing, no longer afraid of being defeated. The greatest fear, being abandoned, had already happened. And when the greatest fear becomes reality, the rest is just emptiness. The world kept turning. New faces appeared in the ring, new stories took the spotlight. Mike Tyson became a name spoken in the past tense, sometimes with a sigh. The greatest destruction wasn't losing fame, but losing the rhythm of life. He no longer knew what a good day looked like, no longer knew where joy came from, if not from instant thrills. And when the thrills passed, the void returned, deeper. Addiction at this stage wasn't a choice. It was the reflex of someone without healthy tools to endure emotions. Mike hadn't been taught how to be sad, how to regret, how to forgive himself. He'd been taught how to fight. When he could no longer fight, he fought himself with bad decisions. And society, which had once celebrated his brutality, now stood outside watching the decline, sometimes with cold curiosity. There were moments when Mike realized where he was on this path. Brief moments when he saw clearly, if he continued, the end wouldn't need a big tragedy to close it. It would just fade out. But realization didn't mean change. Change required a new structure, a new discipline, a new reason to live, things Mike didn't have yet. He had survived poverty, violence, defeat and prison, but surviving doesn't teach you how to live. And so Mike Tyson existed in a suspended state, no longer afraid, no longer proud, just a lingering wariness. A man once forged into a weapon, now not knowing where to set the weapon down. He still breathed, still moved, still appeared in public, but inside, the fire had gone out, leaving cold ashes. Mike survived, but he didn't live. And in that terrifying quiet, the unanswered question echoed again, slowly and persistently. If not Iron Mike, then who was he? And did he still have enough time to find the answer? No punch had prepared Mike Tyson for this moment. No training, no philosophy, no survival instinct helped a father stand firm when his child left the world. In 2009, the name Exodus Tyson entered Mike's life not as a story, but as a wound that would never close. The accident happened quietly, cruelly, without needing drama. A cord, a moment of carelessness, a room that seemed safe, and then Mike Tyson's 4-year-old daughter was no longer breathing. No ring, no referee, no bell, just absolute silence, the kind that leaves no room for hope. When Mike got the news, everything inside him collapsed at once. Not in the angry, explosive way the world had seen before. This time it was complete breakage. No more Iron Mike, no more monster, no more fighting instinct, just a trembling father, on his knees before the reality that the greatest power of his life, the ability to protect, had failed. Mike had beaten men bigger, more dangerous, but in the face of his daughter's death, he was so helpless he could barely breathe. This pain allowed no resistance. It didn't need an opponent. It won the moment it appeared. In the days that followed, Mike Tyson was drained of life force. He didn't cry the way people expected. He was empty. Empty in a terrifying way. Every defense mechanism that had helped him survive poverty, violence, prison was useless. Fists didn't help. Money didn't help. Fame didn't help. The things that once saved him from feeling weak now only highlighted the brutal truth. There are losses no strength can touch. Mike couldn't negotiate with fate, couldn't intimidate it, couldn't take it back. For the first time in his life, Mike Tyson faced pain with no escape. No round that ends. No saving bell. A father's pain doesn't follow rules. It returns in the morning, when the house is too quiet. It returns at night, when memories of his daughter's laughter echo in his head like torture. Mike was no longer afraid of the world. He was afraid of his own memories. Afraid of the moments he should have been there. Afraid of the unanswerable question, what if, in this tragedy, Mike was no longer the center of everything? He was no longer allowed to be the main character. He was just a father who lost his child, standing on the edge of life, watching the rest go on without Exodus. His daughter's death exposed the deepest thing in Mike. He didn't need to be feared. He needed to be loved, and to be there to protect. And when that was gone, every past victory became meaningless. Mike had thought he'd hit rock bottom in prison, but true rock bottom is living on in a world where your child no longer exists. No one around Mike knew what to say. No comfort was big enough. No philosophy deep enough. And Mike, who had once used violence to communicate, now had no language. He didn't know how to express this pain. He only knew how to carry it, step by step, day by day. There were mornings he woke up and took a few seconds to remember that Exodus was gone. And in those few seconds, the world was still normal. Then memory crashed in, and everything collapsed again. This was the only fight Mike couldn't learn to endure gradually. Every day was new, hurt like the first time. This tragedy didn't turn Mike Tyson into a better person right away. It didn't heal. It broke. But in that breaking a raw truth emerged. Mike had never truly been taught how to love without fearing loss. And now loss had come in the most absolute way. No opponent to blame. No system to fight. Just the fragility of human life. The thing Mike had tried to ignore his whole life with strength. Exodus Tyson left, taking with her the last piece of Iron Mike. Not the ring legend, but the illusion that he could control everything if he was strong enough. From here Mike no longer fought to win. He only existed to endure. And in that endless round pain, the man who once made the world tremble learned the most painful lesson. There are losses that don't make you weaker, but make you realize you're only human. After Exodus's death, Mike Tyson no longer had the strength to keep self-destructing, not because he'd grown stronger, but because he was completely exhausted. When a person touches pain nothing can compare to, they have only two choices: keep drifting until they disappear, or stop and look straight at the truth, no matter how cruel. For Mike, awakening didn't come as a sacred moment. It came slowly, heavily, and late. But it came. Sobriety wasn't a beautiful decision. It was a daily struggle. Mike had to learn to wake up without anything to numb the feeling, had to learn to sit with memories of his daughter without running, had to learn to endure raw emotions, the kind he'd never been taught as a kid. For someone used to solving everything with violence and substances, sobriety was like stepping onto the battlefield unarmed. But Mike chose to stay in that state, not because he believed he deserved forgiveness, but because he understood that running anymore wouldn't save anyone. Mike began acknowledging his guilt quietly, not in grand speeches, not with apologies begging for public sympathy. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He knew some things can't be forgiven, at least not by those he'd hurt. What Mike chose was facing the truth that he'd hurt others, the truth that he'd hurt himself, the truth that fame had once shielded him from responsibility, but couldn't shield him from consequences. For the first time in his life, Mike Tyson learned to talk about fear with words. Not fear of losing fights, but fear of abandonment, fear of not being loved, fear that he was a person beyond repair. He learned to name shame, the emotion he'd once suppressed with fists. Shame for what he'd done, shame for missed chances to be good, shame for living too long as an applauded monster. Speaking those things didn't lighten Mike right away, but it made him more real, and that was the only foundation for any change. Late awakening brought no miracles. Mike understood his past couldn't be erased, no good deed could balance the harm done, and he accepted that. That acceptance wasn't surrender, it was letting go of the illusion that he could fix everything. Instead, Mike focused on something smaller, humbler, but far harder, trying to be better each day. Not to be loved again, not to be cheered, but to stop causing more pain. Mike learned to listen, something he'd never done at his peak, listening to others' stories, listening to uncomfortable feedback, listening to silence. He learned to accept that some people would never look at him neutrally, let alone with sympathy, and he no longer fought that, no longer angry, no longer justifying, just the raw presence of a man who understood change didn't need an audience. There were days Mike still fell. Sobriety isn't a straight line. There were nights memories hit hard, mornings he woke with heaviness in his chest. But unlike before, Mike no longer saw those moments as total failure. He saw them as inevitable parts of living truly, living without hiding, living without shielding himself with power, living with the fragility he once despised. On this journey, Mike didn't claim to be a role model. He didn't say people should follow him. He just said he was trying not to hurt more, trying to take responsibility for words and actions, trying to be more present with family, trying to respect others' boundaries, something he never understood when young. Those efforts didn't erase tragedy, but they created a different direction for the life left. Late awakening is a form of courage rarely celebrated. It brings no titles, no cheers, no belts, just sober mornings, hard conversations, and the repeated daily choice, not to go back to the old path. Mike Tyson understood he'd always carry his past like a shadow, but he also understood the shadow didn't have to lead the way. Having lost so much, Mike learned a simple but painful truth: living isn't winning, it's not surrendering to yourself. And though he could never erase what happened, he still chose to stay with the truth, with fear, with shame, because that was the only way for the remaining life, short or long, not to become another cycle of self-destruction. At 59, Mike Tyson is no longer the man who made the world hold its breath when he stepped into the ring. No more belts, no more blinding lights, no more illusions of invincibility, but also no more of what imprisoned him for half his life, the fear of returning to being that abandoned child. Today's Mike Tyson lives slower, quieter, more present in each moment. He doesn't try to prove who he is. He just tries to stay with the person he is now. The world once feared Mike Tyson. Then it hated him. Then it pitied him. And finally, it learned to see him as a complex human, full of cracks, not reducible to the word legend. Mike is no longer unbeatable, but he's also no longer running. He knows clearly what he caused, what he lost, and doesn't try to rewrite the past with pretty stories. The scars are still there, in memories, in irreparable relationships, in pain with no comfort. Mike doesn't deny them. He accepts. Mike Tyson's life is a long chain of paying the price for an abandoned childhood. Brownsville didn't just teach him to fight, it taught him to doubt, to defend, to believe love was too fragile to rely on. Cus D'Amato gave him structure, but couldn't live forever to teach him self-control. Fame came too early, power too fast, and the price came late but heavy. Every phase of Mike's life carried a lesson that arrived after the damage was done, and Mike paid the tuition with his own life. At 59, Mike Tyson no longer tries to fix what can't be fixed. He doesn't ask to be understood in convenient ways. He doesn't ask to be loved. He just wants to be real. Real with good days and bad days. Real with imperfect sobriety. Real with memories of Exodus without turning them into rhetoric. Real with mistakes he knows will follow him to the end. That realness doesn't lighten him, but it makes him stand firmer, not because he's stronger, but because he no longer has to act strong. Today's Mike Tyson knows not every fight has an ending bell. Some pains have no final round, some losses have no compensating win, and some people have to learn to keep living without expecting redemption. He doesn't talk about bright hope. He talks about the discipline of acceptance, about waking up, breathing, and not going back to the old road, about apologizing when needed, being silent when appropriate, and listening more than speaking. Those small things don't make a legend, but they make the remaining life. Sometimes, Mike looks back at old footage, the KOs, the fear in opponents' eyes, and sees a person he once thought he needed to become to survive. Now he doesn't need that anymore. Doesn't need others' fear to feel safe, doesn't need power to stay, doesn't need wins to hide emptiness. He's fallen too many times to know that standing tall doesn't mean being invincible. Standing tall means not running. Mike Tyson's life doesn't close with complete redemption. No triumphant march. No story healed with everyone. Just a man who understands he'll always carry what happened. And that's no longer a sentence. It's the truth. And living with the truth, each day, is already a form of courage. Mike once didn't know. At 59, Mike Tyson no longer falls, not because he can't fall, but because he's fallen too many times already. Those falls took the illusions, the pride, the rage he leaned on. What remains is a man who knows he's fragile, knows he's wrong, knows he can't go back, and still chooses to stay. Stay with the present. Stay with responsibility. Stay with a life that's not glamorous but real. And perhaps that's the most fitting ending for this story. Not blinding light, not absolute darkness, but acceptance, where a person no longer needs to prove anything to keep living. There are people who don't fall because they've fallen too many times already. The story of Mike Tyson saddens us not because he was once great, but because the price for that greatness was paid with an unprotected childhood. From poor, violent Brownsville, the lisping, vulnerable boy who only had pigeons as refuge, learned a cruel lesson. Weakness is a death sentence. When Cus D'Amato appeared, it was the first time Mike was kept. Boxing became a substitute family, and fear was forged into a weapon. But tragedy began the moment Cus died. Success came too fast after the funeral. No one said no. Discipline eroded, and the Tokyo loss to Buster Douglas killed the myth, exposing the fragility of a man who hadn't yet grown up. Then prison in 1992 showed how meaningless power is. No belt shields the soul when facing the Brownsville kid in the mirror. The peak was the 1997 Holyfield moment, the ear bite, a public sound of losing control, followed by years of quiet self-destruction in addiction, loneliness, money evaporating. But the deepest pain, beyond any round, was Exodus Tyson's death, when fists no longer worked, only a helpless father remained. And from that deepest bottom late awakening, sobriety, admitting faults, learning to speak of shame, became the most admirable thing. The lesson for Americans isn't in idolizing strength, but in how we protect children, say no at the right time, and value mental healing as much as achievement. Because there are people who don't fall, only because they've fallen too many times already. If the story of Mike Tyson makes you reflect on strength, loss, and the cost of an unprotected childhood, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue listening together to life journeys full of truth and depth. Thank you for joining us, and see you in the next video where we keep looking straight at the stories behind the spotlight.